remember what it was like before there was somebody else up there who loved you? There was no such thing as executive class service to Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. With first-class legroom, free cocktails for everyone, and a schedule you could depend on. Remember?
Commercial air travel is one of the safest ways to move across the globe. Every day, more than 100,000 flights take off and land without incident. Statistically, you're safer at 30,000 feet than you are driving to the airport. Modern jets are designed to handle storms, turbulence, and even lightning strikes. But beneath the confidence of modern flight lurked a hidden danger. Airlines were flying aging jets thousands of times a year, pushing them far beyond what engineers had ever imagined. Inspections were rushed, cracks were ignored, and regulators looked the other way. It was only a matter of time before one of those planes came apart in the sky. And on April 28, 1988, for the passengers of Aloha Airlines Flight 243, that time had come. At 24,000 feet, a calm commuter flight turned into a nightmare in one of the most shocking incidents in aviation history. So what happened on Flight 243? And what were the warning signs that were ignored and led to this disaster? Let's try and find out.
Hello, I'm Mike Droberg, a Marine Corps veteran and filmmaker, and we will try to answer these questions on today's episode of Forgotten History.
By the late 1980s, commercial air travel had become so reliable that millions of people boarded planes every single day without giving it a second thought. Engineers had built redundancies into every system, pilots trained endlessly for emergencies, and passengers grew accustomed to the idea that once the wheels left the ground, they were essentially untouchable until arrival. In Hawaii, that confidence in the skies was magnified by routine. The state is a chain of islands, each dependent on air travel for business, tourism, and daily life. Short commuter hops between Maui, Oahu, and the Big Island were as common as a bus ride. Planes didn't just connect vacationers to paradise. They carried school teachers, workers, families, and retirees back and forth, often several times a week. Aloha Airlines was at the heart of this lifeline. Founded in 1946, the company prided itself on friendly service and efficiency. Their fleet of Boeing 737s were perfectly suited for these short, high-frequency flights. By the late 1980s, some of these aircraft had logged more than 80,000 individual trips, amongst the highest in the world. For Aloha's passengers, the planes weren't just machines, they were familiar, almost like city buses with wings. April 28, 1988 began like any other day in paradise. The morning sun rose over Hilo, painting the Pacific in shades of gold and sapphire. Passengers trickled onto the small terminal for Aloha Airlines Flight 243, a scheduled 35-minute hop to Honolulu. On the tarmac, the Boeing 737 sat waiting. Its registration number was N73711. A plane that had been flying since 1969, nearly 2 decades of service. To the average traveler, it looked like any other jet, reliable and ordinary. 95 passengers boarded, many of them locals. Inside the cockpit sat Captain Robert Schornstheimer, 44 years old, a veteran pilot with thousands of hours logged in the 737. Beside him was First Officer Madeline Tompkins, just 36, sharp and confident, and one of the relatively few female pilots in the airline industry at the time. And in the cabin, 3 flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, greeting passengers, stowing bags, and preparing for takeoff. Among them was Chief Flight Attendant Clarabelle C.B. Lansing, a 58-year-old veteran of the airline. Lansing had been with Aloha for nearly 37 years. She was known for her warmth, her easy laugh, her deep familiarity with the company's planes and passengers. Few people on board had more experience in the skies than she did. At 1:25 in the afternoon, Flight 243 left Hilo Airport. The engines roared to life. The jet rolled down the runway, and within seconds, it was airborne, banking westward over the ocean. For the passengers, it was business as usual. Seatbelts clicked off, conversations picked up, the cabin crew moved about with trays of drinks. And then, in a single violent instant, the ordinary world vanished. With a deafening boom, a section of the fuselage tore open just behind the cockpit. In less than a second, the roof over the forward cabin peeled away like the top of a tin can. The air inside, pressurized for human comfort, exploded outward. The force was unimaginable. Passengers, who had been mid-conversation, were suddenly exposed to the sky itself. Wind screamed through the cabin at over 300 miles per hour, so loud it drowned out every human voice. Overhead bins, ceiling panels, insulation, even seat cushions were ripped away and vanished into the open air. Those not strapped in were hurled against the seats and bulkheads. Papers, drinks, and personal belongings scattered in every direction before being sucked into the void. People clawed for seatbelts, for armrests, for anything to hold on to, as the aircraft itself shook violently. Near the forward galley, Chief Flight Attendant Lansing was standing in the aisle. In that instant of decompression, she was swept away, pulled through the hole in the fuselage, and lost to the sky. Her body was never found. The rest of the crew and passengers were left in a nightmare no one had trained for. The front third of the plane was now a convertible. Oxygen masks deployed, but they dangled uselessly. There was nothing to breathe into when the cabin ceiling was gone. In the cockpit, Captain Schornstheimer and First Officer Tompkins struggled to make sense of the chaos. The roar of the wind was so loud they could barely hear each other, forcing them to shout and gesture as they fought for control. Warning lights flashed, instruments rattled. The 737 was still flying, but barely. Schornstheimer immediately pushed the nose down. He knew that with the roof torn away, the plane was hemorrhaging oxygen. At 24,000 feet, no one in the cabin could survive long enough without pressurization. He dove the crippled jet downward to breathable air, leveling at about 10,000 feet, where passengers could at least draw breath in the gale-force winds. Inside the cabin, the scene was beyond comprehension. Flight attendants crawled down the aisle, clinging to the seats as they tried to check on the passengers. Many were bloodied, cut by flying debris, or suffering from the sheer force of decompression. Some seats had buckled. Overhead wiring and insulation hung down like streamers, whipping violently in the rushing air. And yet, in the middle of this nightmare, the crew held together. First Officer Tompkins worked the throttles and radios as best she could. Captain Schornstheimer wrestled the yoke, guiding the jet towards Kahului Airport on Maui, the closest available runway. Their challenge wasn't just distance, it was whether the plane could endure the strain of descent. Every second, the damaged fuselage threatened to peel apart even further. As they approached Maui, air traffic controllers scrambled emergency crews onto the runway. But from the tower, controllers could hardly believe their eyes. Through binoculars, they saw the jet with its entire roof missing over the forward cabin. The fact that it was still flying was almost inconceivable. The descent was rough. Schornstheimer lined up with the runway, his hands locked on the controls. Tompkins called out airspeeds and altitudes, straining to be heard over the storm. The passengers, silent now, braced for impact, some gripping their seats, others holding hands, resigned to whatever would come next. At 1:58 p.m., less than 35 minutes after leaving Hilo, Flight 243 touched down in Maui. Tires screeched, Smoke poured from landing gear, and the gutted jet rattled down the runway. But somehow, through skill, training, and sheer willpower, it stayed together long enough to safely stop. Fire crews swarmed the aircraft. Emergency slides deployed, and shaken passengers stumbled out onto the tarmac. Of the 95 passengers and 6 crew, 65 were injured. But except for Clarabelle Lansing, every single person had survived. It was, by any measure, a miracle. In the days after Flight 243's miraculous landing, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board descended on Maui. For investigators, the question wasn't how the 737 landed. It was how the roof tore off in the first place. The Boeing 737 involved was nearly 20 years old, one of the oldest in Aloha's fleet. And what investigators found was chilling. Years of constant short flights between islands, thousands upon thousands of takeoffs and landings, had put enormous stress on the airframe. Every cycle of pressurization caused the metal skin to expand and contract. Over time, that invisible stretching created tiny cracks around rivets and joints. On this aircraft, those cracks had spread silently, like veins across the fuselage. Investigators discovered that the skin above the passenger's cabin was riddled with microscopic fractures. In some places, the aluminum was so thin and weakened that it tore apart like paper when pressurized one last time. Even worse, passengers and crews had noticed the warning signs before. Some recalled hearing unusual rattles and seeing small leaks of air near cabin joints on earlier flights. But nothing was done. Maintenance inspections had been carried out, but under a system that largely relied on visual checks and inspectors' eyes running along a fuselage that looked perfectly fine under fresh paint and salt-faded metal. The hairline cracks were practically invisible without more advanced testing. The NTSB concluded that the root cause was widespread metal fatigue and corrosion. In other words, the aircraft had simply been flown to exhaustion. And it wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of a broader culture of cost-cutting and complacency. Airlines were pushing aging jets far beyond their design lives, while regulators allowed outdated inspection methods to continue. Flight 243 wasn't just a freak accident. It was a warning sign, an alarm bell, that exposed how fragile commercial safety could be when profit and routine outweighed vigilance. For the aviation industry, it was a wake-up call. The NTSB's investigation forced airlines and regulators to confront a problem they had long ignored: aging aircraft. The FAA responded by mandating stricter inspection programs, especially for the planes that had logged tens of thousands of cycles. For the first time, airlines were required to use more advanced testing methods to spot cracks invisible to the naked eye. The term aging fleet had entered the public's vocabulary. Passengers began asking how old their aircraft were, and regulators scrambled to assure the public that older planes could still be safe if maintained properly. Boeing and other manufacturers issued new guidelines, and airlines around the world had to reckon with the reality that you couldn't simply keep flying the same jets forever without deeper scrutiny. For Aloha Airlines, the incident was devastating. Though the company continued operating for years, the sight of one of its aircraft, ripped apart, mid-air, left a permanent scar on its reputation. By 2008, after decades of service to the islands, Aloha shut down for good. But the legacy of Flight 243 goes beyond one airline. It reshaped the way the world thought about air safety. Every fuselage inspection, every scan for metal fatigue, every replacement panel on an aging aircraft traces back to that day in April 1988 when a 737 became a convertible at 24,000 feet. And through all the technical lessons and regulatory changes, one truth remained. The survival of the 94 souls on that flight came down to the courage and skill of a crew who refused to give up. Captain Robert Schornstheimer, First Officer Madeline Tompkins, and the surviving flight attendants show what professionalism under pressure looks like. Their actions turned what should have been a certain disaster into one of the most remarkable survivals in aviation history. Captain Schornstheimer was praised for his calm leadership and skill during the emergency. After the incident, he kept flying with Aloha Airlines for years and eventually retired as a respected senior captain. First Officer Tompkins continued flying with Aloha, later upgraded to a captain herself, and went on to have a long career in commercial aviation. She retired in 2010. And Clarabelle Lansing, the veteran flight attendant lost that day, gave her life in service to the airline she loved, the only soul lost on Flight 243. But one question still remains. How many other planes out there today carry hidden cracks no one can see? Safe travels.
Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any comments or show ideas, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks again.